Hello, everyone. We've made it. We're here. I'm Mike Colón. This is episode 100. Yes, you heard that right. Episode 100, 100 of the Mike in New Haven podcast. It is the granddaddy of them all, the big milestone, hopefully the first of many for this show. And I just wanted to take a brief moment to say before I get to my conversation with the 100th guest for this show, thank you. Thank you to everyone that has made this podcast possible. You've all made this show so fun to do. I can't say enough about each and every one of you, from the listeners who've taken time out of your day. Maybe you're in the car listening to me. Maybe you watch me on YouTube. Whatever the case may be, your support is something I cannot say enough about. I appreciate it. And it's really just something that leaves me in awe sometimes because, you work hard to put together a good show, but you never think that that many people are listening to you. You wonder, really if anybody's listening at all. But the feedback I get from you guys and the audience and your loyalty is something that really has touched my heart. And I just want to take a brief moment to say thank you and I appreciate you. And I'm glad you've stuck it out with me for what's been quite the ride, all the way from episode one, which is going to be 4 years in December that I started doing the show when I had episode one in December of 2017 to today, the September day in which I'm preparing for my 100th guest and my 100th show. The fact that you've stuck around this long is something that really, really means a lot. And again, the guest too. I can't say enough about the guest. I've gotten the chance to speak with some really interesting people from all different walks of life. I mean, you talk about people in the sports industry, the news industry, the fire service, law enforcement, whatever the case may be. The fact that these people have been able to make the time for me, come on my show and share so many great stories about their lives and the lives of others who they've crossed paths with along the way is something that, again, I'm forever indebted to you guys, and I cannot thank you enough for doing. I could name everybody, but we don't have the time for that, and I don't want to miss anybody. So what I'll say is simply thank you. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy episode 100 of the Mike in New Haven podcast. And again, from the bottom of my heart, I say thank you, I appreciate you, and I love you. See you at the end of the show. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to, this is it, the milestone 100th episode of the Mike in New Haven podcast. I had to go big for it, and we did. I'll introduce my guests in a moment. However, if you haven't checked out the previous episode, it was a continuation of the miniseries Tales from the Boom Room, Profiles of the NYPD's Bomb Squad with retired NYPD Bomb Squad Detective Kevin Barry. Kevin discussed his career in emergency service, going to the Bomb Squad in 1993, defusing a live bomb strapped to a pipe bomber in 1990 on Queen Street, investigations into 1996 TWA Flight 800 crash, 93 World Trade Center bombing, and of course his response to 9/11 and the chilling last interaction he had with Detective Claude Richards, who that day, sadly, became the sixth squad member in the bomb squad's history to die in the line of duty. So in this episode, I mean, this is really cool for me. And I have to thank Kevin Barry for helping this come to fruition, because my next guest has had quite the life. And so for the 100th episode, I should say, we introduce him, and he has had a life both in law enforcement and, of course, in the news world. A native of Montclair, New Jersey, his career has seen him get the chance to work with the likes of Bill Bratton on the law enforcement side and Peter Jennings on the news side. He's conducted interviews with the likes of John Gotti, and most notoriously in 1998, which we will be discussing, Osama Bin Laden, with stops at NBC, ABC, CBS, local station WNEW, and of course on the law enforcement side, the DNI, NYPD, LAPD, and FBI. He currently serves as the NYPD's Deputy Commissioner of Public Information, as well as Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counterterrorism. For the 100th episode of the Mike in New Haven podcast, we welcome John Miller. John, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks. And thank you for the honor of letting me be the 100th episode of the show, which I love, because not only do I see that you and I have all the same friends, but when you talk to them, I learn stories about them that I never knew, even though I thought I knew everything about them. So you do a great job on the show, and try not to get me to tell one of those so that everybody knows.
Thank you so much. It's an honor hearing that from you, and I appreciate that very much. So as I said when I was introducing you, you grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, son of a reporter. Take me through your early years.
Well, my dad was a newspaper man, and he wasn't your average newspaper man. He was a columnist who wrote kind of gossip columns and was syndicated, kind of in the Walter Winchell mode of, reporters from the 50s, but he carried that through even into the 70s. But the thing about him was I wasn't just his kid, I was kind of his best friend. We did everything together on the weekends. And if he was covering a story, he would take me with him. So whatever it was, the demonstrations against the Vietnam War, the clashes with police at Columbia University, the crime of the day, on the weekends, we would be in the car going somewhere to do something, some adventure, and something would come over the police radio and I would go. And, that, Mike, that started like when I was 7. But, when I was around 12, I thought, you're going to these things and you're just this kid and you look very out of place. And you have no real purpose. I mean, your dad's there, he's got a press card, he's covering it. So I also thought these things are fascinating and you're a witness to moments of crisis and a witness to history, and there's no record of it. So I got a camera, and then I got another camera, and then I got a better camera, and then I got a good camera. But by then I was taking pictures of everything, and that was it for me. My father was a newspaper man, but I wanted to be a newspaper photographer because I had figured out once you showed up with a camera, you had that front row seat to whatever was going on, whether it was a disaster in progress or a big ceremony or the president was in town, you could capture that moment. And that was my dream. Destiny took a hand. I kind of loved listening to the police radio because that had been kind of the background music of my childhood, in between, Sinatra songs on the car radio. And I'd gotten pretty good at having an ear for what was an important call, and started tipping off. The only television reporter who was nice to me in the field, everybody else was like, kid, get out of the way, you don't belong here, move back. Marvin Scott, now with Channel 11, then with Channel 5. He saw something in me. Later, I would find out, because that's what he did when he was a kid. He had a camera, he showed up on things, and he would sell pictures to the newspapers just the way I was. That was the great equalizer. The newspaper didn't care if you were 14 or 13. They just want to know, did you get the better shot than anybody else? And, they would buy it. So I considered myself not just an 8th grader, but a professional photographer. And Marvin actually kind of at least pretended to take me seriously. So whenever I heard a good call on the police radio, I would tip him off. And finally, he got me a job in the newsroom, I think because he was tired of me calling him. And I got to work at Channel 5 on the news desk. And that's what steered me into television.
John Miller is our guest here on the milestone 100th episode of the Mike Newman podcast. And so you started out at WNEW. Now, when people hear WNEW, they think of the old rock station 102.7. If you're an Opie and Anthony fan, of course, they used to be on WNEW back in the late 90s and early 2000s. But there was also a television station. So
it was Metro Media Television before it was bought by Fox.
Right. So working there, I guess, I asked this to any journalist I get on the show. What were some of the key lessons you learned early on about the profession that still guided you throughout your career in journalism?
There was a sign over the door at Channel 5 that said, there are at least 2 sides to every story. How many did you get? And you saw that going out the door and you saw that coming in the door. And it was a reminder. You may think you know the story going out because somebody handed you a piece of AP wire copy and said, go out there and do this. But make sure you actually find the story when you get there. I worked for a brilliant editor, the managing editor, Mark Monsky, who taught me a great lesson, which is, here's the story and here's the people you have to talk to. And I came back to him the first time and said, they won't talk, so we don't have a story. And he said, no, you call them back. And you tell them, we're doing the story whether they talk or not. If they want their side on, this is their chance. And he meant it. And I learned to kind of tell people it's not really up to you whether we cover the story. And that brought a lot of people forward to tell their side. And remember, we were supposed to get at least 2 sides, and usually there were more. So those were my early lessons in journalism, and I kept them with me as long as I worked.
In 1985, you made the lateral move to NBC, if I'm not mistaken. So this is a legendary station. It's got some legendary folks working there. I mean, you're talking about the late Roger Grimsby. You're talking about Chuck Scarborough, who's still there to this day. Lou Young was there at the time. He retired not too long ago from WCBS2. He's a former guest of this show. So working around, it's kind of like, when I have my cops and firemen on, when you're watching the senior man in the precinct or in the firehouse, either directly or indirectly, you learn from those individuals what to do and maybe even what not to do. So was that the case with you in the newsroom with people like that?
It was going from Channel 5, where, we weren't pretty. We were very scrappy at Channel 5, but we got the job done, and we had an hour every night, to NBC. WNBC, News Center 4 at the time, they had a 5 o'clock, and they had a 6 o'clock, and they had 11 o'clock, and you had to turn a story for each one every day, and it had to be different. The 5 o'clock version could be one version, but you had to update it and make it more interesting, even if it was the same story for the 6 o'clock news. And then you had to make it shorter and have something new for the 11 o'clock news. And unlike Channel 5, it was all live from here, live from there, live from the other place. You spent your life, meeting a live truck somewhere. So for me, it was a real shock to my system. At Channel 5, we had one broadcast a day. It was at 10 o'clock. It lasted an hour. You had all day to think about your story, write your story, get your story together. And, you looked around the Channel 4 newsroom, and as you said, Mike, every place had a team of reporters and a couple of really good ones. Channel 2, Channel 7. At NBC, you looked around, and there was Gabe Pressman, and there was Tony Guida, and there was Lou Young, and there was Chuck Scarborough, and there was Pat Harper, and there was, they didn't just have a large bench, but they had a bench of all stars. And, there you were, the kid from Channel 5, thinking they made a mistake bringing me here. And then, I managed to walk into 2 years of some incredible stories that were right in the bullseye of where I had access, and managed to, I think, equip myself so that I could feel a little more among equals. But I've got to say, it was an intimidating place to work when you looked around the room and said, I've got to measure up.
Right. I'm a baseball fan, for example, big Yankee fan. Look at the 98 Yankees. Look at their bench. They had Tim Raines and Darryl Strawberry coming off the bench. And imagine being a young kid like Ricky Leday. And then here you are with all those players. So
call me Ricky.
So you can relate to it in a sense. So we'll get to the major stories in a moment. But first, where did the police ride along start? Because there's a funny story before you answer. Do you remember Scott Wagner?
Yeah.
He's a friend of mine, and he's been on this show. And he was joking with me when he was on that he was a detective formerly with the since defunct housing police. And he would see you pull up, and he would joke with you, John, can we ride around in your car? Because it's a heck of a lot nicer than the crap that we got. I guess they didn't have the best cars back then. So when did the ride-alongs with the police, both housing and, of course, the NYPD start for you?
Well, the first one for me was up in Truck 2 with Bobby Benz and his partner, and Kevin Barry was up there down in Truck 1. And I was with Channel 5, and I said, I want to do a ride along with Truck 2 up in Harlem. And I went out for a night with them, and you're going on one emergency call after another, and yet each one is different. This one's a gun job. They're suiting up with vests and shotguns. That one's an emotionally disturbed person, and they're trying to talk sense to somebody who is completely irrational and do it in a gentle way. The third one is somebody who's got a ring stuck on their finger, and their finger's swelling up, and they need to get the ring off. And every time they go back to that truck, they open another compartment and pull out some tool you never heard of, like some tiny little wheel with a crank that will actually cut through a ring on a finger that's swelling up too big to take it off. They're like, what was that? A hacksaw for midgets? But they were amazing. And, I just, I thought that was having a ride along where you didn't have to worry about doing the story, bringing a camera crew and getting all the shots, but just to learn to soak it up like a sponge was really great. And emergency service was terrific that way. They were very generous. But then, I went out one night with the fire marshals during a time when, arson was ravaging the city, going from fire to fire, and say, how do you investigate a crime scene where the evidence necessarily goes up in smoke? And I learned a lot from them. And then I went out with the senior citizens robbery squad. So to me, as a guy who never really got through college, this was my graduate course in the streets of New York City, being taught by these brilliant professors, each one a specialist in their own area. Now, then there was me, because, I get the Scott Wagner joke, which is I went out and got a police car, that was like some used police car from some police department. And everything they'd pulled out, I put back into it, radios and, antennas and all that. So when I rolled up on something, it always looked official, and I could hear every call coming from every place. And, that car became widely known to members of the police department in New York City.
So that brings us to the mid 80s. And the first instance of a really notorious interaction you had is Dennis Malvasi. Now, for those of you that maybe don't know who Dennis Malvasi is, you may remember my first interview with Don Sadawi as part of my Tales from the Boom Room Profiles of the NYPD's Arson, Explosion, and Bomb Squad miniseries. He was going around bombing abortion clinics. He was a radical. We're not going to dive too deep into it, but that was his purpose. And at the time, he was on the loose. And of course, I believe somehow, one way or another, he comes into contact with you, and a series of events takes place that eventually leads to him agreeing to turn himself in, and subsequently he was imprisoned. So as far as the full scope of the story, I'll let you take it from there. Take me through what that situation was like.
So Dennis John Malvasi was a wraith. He was a ghost. We didn't know his name. We didn't know anything about him. We just knew that every couple of weeks a bomb was going off in an abortion clinic somewhere somewhere in the New York area. And that the bomb started in the middle of the night, but now we're going off in the daytime and in more crowded places. And it was very clear that he was escalating and that somebody was going to get hurt or killed. His last bombing actually had what the bomb squad calls a hang fire. The detonator didn't function fully to get the main charge off, but it functioned enough for a puff of smoke to come up and to set off the smoke alarms and the sprinkler systems. And when the firemen got there, they found this package packed with dynamite and a detonator that had had a malfunction. But they also found a rental agent for that building handcuffed to a railing in a stairwell. That bomb would have blown the floor up above it, down below it, and probably killed the guy in the stairwell or anybody else who was there. So it was clear that Malvasi was escalating. The other thing was there was a thumbprint on that bomb that was supposed to blow up with it and didn't. And while it didn't ring in the criminal records, the detectives from Arson Explosion and the investigator from ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Alex Diatri and that team, they figured that this person certainly had some experience with explosives. And they started going through the explosive licenses at the fire department, matching the pictures on the licenses to the sketch that was given by the rental agent who was handcuffed in the hallway. And they came up with a match. So then they went the thumbprint to the fingerprints on the license. And they came up with a match on that. And that gave them a name, Dennis J. Malvasi. So then the hunt was on. What was interesting was when I found out that Malvasi had been identified, I called Bob Creighton at ATF and said, I know that you guys have the name, I have the name, and I want to do the story. And Creighton said, you can't do that. We're this close to getting this guy. And if he knows that we know that the whole world knows, Right now he's skimming right across the surface. We just have to snatch him up. But if you do that story, he's going to burrow under in places where we will never find him. And I said, okay, so I get that. And I'm a journalist, but I'm also a friend of law enforcement. But what happens when he places that next bomb and people are killed and it becomes public that you knew his name, have his picture, I knew his name, have his picture. We could have blasted that out to the public and said, find this guy, be on the lookout. And we never did that because I don't know how I'm going to explain that to my boss. And I don't know how you're going to explain it to yours. And Creighton, who was one of the great special agents in charge, he said, that makes sense, but we're very close. They were running wiretaps and surveillances all over town. He said, give me 10 days and then go with your story, because that means we weren't as close as we think we are. And it wasn't a week into the 10 days that one night Creighton called my house and said, go with your story tonight. We're going to announce it tomorrow. So you get the scoop for agreeing to hold back, but you better be ready. That was like at 9:30. That means the 11 o'clock news is like in an hour and a half. So I literally ran out of the house, ran up to the office, pulled the footage together, got into an edit room, ran the story. And this is one of those like only could happen in New York stories. I broke the story. The mad bomber on the loose in New York has been identified. Here's his name. This is what he looks like. Here's his background, an explosive expert who was trained in the war in Vietnam by the Army, now, back here in New York, doing these bombings. And the phone rings on the desk, and Maria Uliano, who had the night desk, answers the phone and calls me on the phone in my car and says, I just got a call from a woman who said she dated this guy that you just named as the bomber, and that he's the nicest, kindest, sweetest guy and would never do such a thing. And I said, well, does she have his number? She gave me the number. We looked it up in the reverse directory and it came to an address on 26th Street. And I went to the address on 26th Street and it was a big warehouse and it took up the entire block. It's funny because this is the warehouse where, my dad used to take us when we were kids and he would drive underneath it and people would scatter into the shadows. It was a place where people used to bring stolen cars to strip them. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is the warehouse where your dad used to scare you as a kid. And here I was back there at midnight alone looking for the mad bomber. And I looked on the directory and there was a name that came back to that number. And it said 20th floor. The guard's desk was empty. I pressed the elevator. The elevator only went up to 18 and it opened into pure blackness. And I stepped out and said, you're standing in this dark hallway in a building that you know nothing about, except that you used to get scared here by your dad as a kid. And you're on the 18th floor looking for 20 and there isn't a single light on. So I took a flashlight out and I went up 2 stories to what would be 20 and it was the roof. And there on the roof, there was a little brick building and inside the window with the flashlight, I could see there was wires and things on the table and it made immediate sense. This was Malvasi's bomb factory. This is probably where he put this stuff together. There was a sign on the door that said Vietnam Veterans Art Projects and so on. There was a trash can in the stairwell and I went through it and pulled out a couple of parking tickets and other things that had a name on it. The name traced to a guy who worked in a church around the corner. And I set up there, followed him and jumped out with 2 camera crews and said, like, we know that you run that place on the roof and that's where the bomber made the bombs. You're in touch with him and, you got to come clean. And he basically said, stop. We have a network. We have signals that we can send, but I don't know where he is and I don't know how to call him up. But if you give me the weekend, I can get you an answer. So I thought, okay, It's Friday night. We've got our video, we've got our confrontation, we've got our lead. I'll probably never hear from this guy, but we'll put the whole thing on Monday. And Monday morning, the guy calls up and says, here's the deal. If Cardinal O'Connor appeals to Dennis to turn himself in as the leader of the Catholic Church in New York, Dennis will do it. Called the Archdiocese, had a little discussion back and forth with Monsignor Finn, who was the public affairs guy for the Archdiocese at the time. And he said, well, I don't think so. This is not what we do, but I'll run it by the Cardinal. He called back half an hour later and said, the Cardinal says, come over right now. I sat down with Cardinal O'Connor and he said, do you want me to look at you or do you want me to look in the camera? And I said, well, it's an interview. Look at me. I said, no, you know what? Look into the camera because you're not really talking to me. You're talking to him. And Cardinal O'Connor, without a note or a script, said, Dennis, what you're doing is wrong. And I'm worried that people are going to get hurt. Some innocent person, a fireman, a police officer, you need to call here, talk to me or Monsignor Kowski, who you know, Michael. And, you know, we need to get you to stop this and to come in. And I put it on the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, the 11 o'clock news. Competitors went crazy. They all wanted an interview with the Cardinal and so on and so forth. How did you get the scoop? Why was it just you? But they didn't realize there were leads behind this. And the next day I get a call from John O'Brien from ATF who says, he's coming in. I'm like, great. Who's he? He said, the bomber. I'm like, he's coming in where? He said, he's coming in here to the post office, where ATF was located in the post office building on Church Street. And I said, when? He said, he's coming now. So I jumped in the car. I called a camera crew. I went careening downtown across sidewalks, knocking over fruit stands, you know, it was like out of a bad movie, and got there. And of course, the bomber walks in and, you know, he's in his disguise. There's ATF agents staked out with shotguns, with machine guns. They're, you know, all over the lobby. The postal police are ready. And finally, because he doesn't look like him, he comes up to the postal cop and he says, hi, I'm like the mad bomber. I'm supposed to surrender. And the postal cop's going like, here he is. And they all jump him. And they take him upstairs and Diatri has him in the interrogation room. And I said, I got to ask him one question. And they're like, you can't ask him a question. You're a reporter. He's under arrest. He's in the interrogation room. I'm like, one question. So they bring me in and Diatri is really annoyed at this. And he says, what's the question? And I said, the question is, did he see the Cardinals appeal on television or did he read about it like in the paper? Or did he see it last night on the news? And Diatri says, did you see the Cardinal on the news last night saying you have to surrender on Channel 4 with this guy? And he goes like this. And I said, that's all I needed to know. And I went downstairs and we went live and broke the story. Dennis J. Malvasi, the fugitive abortion clinic bomber who's been sought by New York City police and federal authorities for weeks, you know, has turned himself in here at the post office at ATF. And that was based on his watching this broadcast last night with Cardinal O'Connor's appeal. And that was one of those stories, Mike, in the question of like, what does it all mean? That was one of those stories where you say, we all serve the same public. Reporters do, here at the police, we do, but we do it in different ways. And that was one of those examples as a reporter. If you were doing your job as a reporter in a good way, did you get the story? And if you didn't put it out right away, did you get a better story later? And the way you did it by knowing when to go, but also when to hold back, but then when to go, did you actually serve the public better than you would have if you used everything the minute you got it? And I think the answer is yes. I think the answer is the press should never be an arm of law enforcement, and law enforcement should never ask the media for that. But there are places where they will come together serving the public in their own different way, that if they do it together, really works well for public safety. And I think that story was one of those.
And I think the context of the time for my listeners that may not recall or may not be lovers of history, such as myself, the context of the time gets lost if you're not familiar with it, because now we look at terrorism after 2001, which we'll get to a little bit later, a little differently. But back then in the 70s and 80s, again, I go back to my interviews with the fellows from the bomb squad, bombings happened a lot. I mean, you had the Weather Underground, you had the FALN. This was not too far after the bombing at One Police Plaza in 1982, New Year's Eve, that gravely injured 3 members of the NYPD, including 2 bomb squad detectives. And so people are very weary of this. Whatever the motivation may be, domestic terrorism at the city, or in the city, I should say, was fraught in the 70s and 80s. And that was definitely one of the more notorious instances. And to piggyback off something you said earlier, I believe there was one instance where, had it not been for the sharp instincts of Dennis Mulcahy, a detective with the bomb squad, who I'm trying to get on this show, there would have been fatalities, because they were clearing out one clinic in particular. And Dennis just had this feeling that there was something else there, a secondary device. And you had firemen rummaging through everything, just making sure that nobody else was in there. Police, it was a chaotic scene. And Dennis went to the 2nd floor on his own volition, discovered a device, and with seconds left on the clock, rendered it safe. So that was a particularly wild story. And I'll give a plug to my friend. If you want to read more about it, check out Don Stowie's book, Rendered Safe, Tales from an NYPD Bomb Tech. So that brings us to your interactions with John Gotti. Here is someone that is not too far removed from a brazen and hostile and blood-soaked takeover of the Gambino crime family. He has Paul Castellano infamously murdered and his driver, Tommy Bilotti, outside Spark Steakhouse in Manhattan in 1985. He's the Teflon Don. They can't pin anything on him. He's got this gregarious, outgoing personality. I mean, he is the most notorious gangster, arguably, of the 20th century, maybe the latter half for sure of the 20th century. And you sat down with him not just once, but several times. You're staring at someone who, despite all that, is a cold-blooded killer. And if you cross him, you're a phone call away from certain death. Take me through sitting down with, like I said, arguably the most notorious mobster of the 20th century.
Well, it's an interesting evolution, I guess, as a story, because, John Gotti was a player in the Gambino crime family, but his brother had been involved in drug dealing, and that had angered the boss of the Gambino family, who was going to probably execute Gotti's brother. So Gotti made a move, which was a bold power play. He killed the boss, Paul Castellano. It was December 16th, 1985, just days before Christmas. The Christmas lights were up. Christmas carols were blaring over the outside speakers in the office building across the street from Spark Steakhouse. When Castellano pulled up with his driver, Tommy Bilotti, multiple gunmen wearing matching trench coats and Russian fur hats, so that the description of any gunman would be the same as any other gunman, to confuse witnesses. They opened fire. They killed Castellano's bodyguard. They killed Castellano. And I remember being on the scene and going live and saying, you're looking at the body of Big Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family, gunned down in a public place on an open street, as a sign that either the mob's ruling commission of the bosses of the 5 families had okayed the execution of one of their own, or that this was a renegade move from someone else inside or out the family that is sure to spark a mob war in New York City, which was kind of a really dramatic moment for someone who had covered organized crime for as long as I had at the time. And an old friend of mine from the NYPD's intelligence division, which is really interesting because now I'm running the intelligence division
Right.
in the NYPD, but he just took me by the elbow and walked me away and said, I know you're going to be looking for what's going on here, but the name you got to think about is John Gotti. And I remember thinking, John Gotti, okay, who's John Gotti? By the next day, we had staked out his club. And when he came out, his bodyguards moved on the camera crew and pushed me this way and the cameraman that way, and we'll end up rolling around. And Gotti got in the car and drove away, and we missed the shot. And that process was repeated a few times. And we were having trouble like getting that shot of him, getting that ability to question him. So finally, One day I get 4 camera crews, stake out the entire block and wait for them for to walk all the way around the block. And it was with Sammy Gravano and Tony Locascio. And I got on the radio and I said, all units move in. And it was like a coordinated assault. Camera crew came this way, camera crew came that way, camera crew came from across the street. No matter where he turned, there was another camera crew, and there was not enough hands or people to block all of them at the same time. And we trekked down the street with this caterpillar of arms and legs and wires and lights and microphones. And I asked him all the questions I want. And he was getting more and more annoyed. And finally I said, he's probably going to kill us now. So I said, all right, I think we got enough. And the camera crews faded into the shadows. And I kept walking down the street with him. And he said, hey, John, what was all that about? I said, well, every time my people come up, your people push them around. No, I always treated you like a gentleman, he said. And I said, that's not treating people like a gentleman. That's like your people pushing my people around. So what's going to happen now, I guess, is I'm just going to have to bring all these people every time we do this. Because that seems to be the only thing that works. And, you could see the calculus going in Gotti's mind, because a lot of what he did was about image. Being the feared boss of the Gambino crime family, the way he dressed in the sharp Brioni suits with the hand-painted ties and the custom-made shirts. Image was important to him, and the image of a mob boss is someone who is quietly in control and feared. And during that walk down the block, he didn't look in control. He didn't look feared. And I know he didn't like that. So he said that night, right there on that street, walking south on Lafayette Street towards Prince, he said, all right, don't ever do that again. And, from now on, my people won't bother your people. And from then on, Mike, I was able to approach John Gotti with my cameraman or crew anytime, ask him a question. He would answer the question, never with a substantive answer. He might repeat the question and say, what do you think? He might come up with a clever quip or a line. But it was funny because to the audience, when they saw all these instances of me and him walking together talking, they thought that I had some special access to the boss of the Gambino crime family. And in fact, the access was gained by a strategy that overwhelmed him one day. And I think he concluded, this 26-year-old kid is not going away. He's kind of annoying, but very persistent, and it's affecting my image. So let me just work with it. And that's how that happened.
That brings us to 1994. There we go. That's an accurate description of me by extension, kind of annoying, but very persistent. I annoyed the heck out of Sergeant Riley. Apology, Sergeant Riley. But if I didn't, you wouldn't be sitting here. So
that's right. Sergeant Riley has obtained a lawful order of protection, but yet here I am. So whatever you did, Mike, has worked.
It worked. So that brings us to 1994. And this is a pivotal time in New York City. I mentioned terrorism earlier. Now there was a shift. There was a 1993 World Trade Center bombing the year prior. Bill Bratton's coming in. And Bill Bratton had familiarity with New York. He had run the New York City Transit Police to great success. And he brings his people from transit with him to the NYPD, most notable being the late, great Jack Maple. And he taps you to come along with him. So this is a real pivotal moment, not just in your career, but in your life. You covered the NYPD for so long. Obviously, you had some notoriety with the Malvasi case and also your interactions with Gotti. And some of your colleagues kidded you saying you were going over to the dark side when you joined the NYPD. So describe that transition to all of a sudden being on the outside of the agency to now, as a reporter covering it, to now being firmly on the inside, the right-hand man to a commissioner who many would agree changed the city for the better.
Well, it was really interesting because you had spent your whole career kind of with your nose pressed up against the glass from the outside looking in. And granted, very much like you, Mike, I had made a lot of close friends. A lot of the barriers had come down. People trusted me. I felt like I was on the inside. I think, you probably know more about law enforcement and the history of these cases and what people did and said in pivotal moments than 99% of the people in law enforcement today. And I felt I had what you had, which is, a deep familiarity. So when I spoke to people and talked to them or met new people, that you had that trust. But there was always that thin line, we're cops and you're not, was the short version. And suddenly going from that, a guy with a press card who was supposed to say on one side of the yellow tape, usually I had actually found my way to the other side by not wearing the press card and looking like I belonged there, to being firmly on the inside was interesting. And, one of the things I love to do was like go home Tuesday nights and watch NYPD Blue, because I felt it was one of those shows that kind of had the real feel of the NYPD for a guy who watched a lot of cop shows. And I was driving home to watch NYPD Blue with one of my friends, and a call came over. It was my third day. There was a police officer shot. It was in Queens. I turned on the lights and sirens. It was, kind of one of those black cars filled with police radios like I'd driven my whole life, but this time I didn't have to worry about being pulled over by the police. And I raced to the hospital where the wounded officer was. And, I remember thinking, so this is really interesting. You're going to be right there at the source of the information. You're going to be getting the raw information as it comes out, not waiting outside the hospital, waiting for what the police are going to tell you and what they're going to leave out and trying to piece it together. You're going to be on the inside. Let's see what that's like. And what happened was we got a complete and clear story, and I wrote it all down. I even talked to the police officer in the emergency room while he was being worked on. Then I talked to his partner. Then I talked to the precinct commander. Then I assembled all the details. And the first thing that happened was a bunch of the details changed. And the second thing that happened was the rest of the details changed. And the third thing that happened was a new set of details came in and the whole story was different. And I turned to John Timoney, and he was the chief of operations, or the chief of department, the 4-star chief. And, he was a brilliant guy, who had an off the boat from Ireland brogue.
Yes.
And he said, well, this is your first lesson in policing. First of all, you think you're going to know it all in here and then give it to them out there. They probably know more about it out there than we do in here. Second of all, the first story is never right. And the second story is usually not right. And sometimes the third story is close. So be careful of what you say and what you find out, and how far you go with the information. And it suddenly occurred to me, wow, so that's the mystery. Nobody on the inside really knows any more than anybody on the outside. It was a shock to the system.
And that's interesting. You mentioned John Timoney, who's not with us anymore. Sadly, we lost him to cancer a few years ago. I believe he ran police departments in Philadelphia and Miami, so an interesting career in law enforcement. But, I've had Chief Anamone on the show previously, and, it doesn't take long in talking with a guy like that to know he was, and still is at 75, a hard charger. Just a guy who loved what he did. Same could be said of Timoney, same could be said of Maple, and obviously Bill Bratton, who has a new book out, by the way, The Profession. So working with these guys, I have to say, great guys, big time figures in policing. Like I said, changed the city for the better in the mid-90s. What's your favorite quality about each guy?
Well, Bill Bratton was amazing because he was just as comfortable at a crime scene in the middle of mayhem as he was in the boardroom. He was a guy who could think tactically, and yet stayed out of the way and let his commanders do their job. But more importantly, he's a guy who thinks big picture. The worst thing you could do to Bill Bratton was to give him a perfectly functioning police department or organization. He liked to take things that were kind of all twisted and sideways and straighten them out. And the minute they were running like a top is when he would start to get bored and say, I need a new challenge. It was amazing to watch him re-engineer the NYPD from an organization that was a high-functioning organization that did really good work, that had terrific cops, but to see if it was functioning as best it possibly could, what could it accomplish? And, I remember going to passing him in the hallway, and he said, "Are you going to the re-engineering meeting about such and such?" And I said, "No, I'm going over here because of, the crisis about whatever." And he said, "There'll be a new crisis every day, but we have to move the organization forward. And there's plenty of people out there to deal with the crisis. Come to the meeting about re-engineering so we can reform the NYPD. I promise you there'll be another crisis tonight or in the morning." And he was right. He had a great sense of the big picture, re-engineered the NYPD, and started a pattern of crime reduction that literally went on for 25 years. Went out to LAPD, re-engineered the LAPD, and reduced gang shootings and violence by 70%, but also citywide violence in a pattern that continued. Re-engineered the NYPD again. And when everybody thought crime was as low as it could go, re-engineer it to bring it to historic lows that have never been matched, and did it while building community relations. When Bill Bratton reset the NYPD, he had crime at the lowest ever. He had complaints against police officers steadily declining, lawsuits against the police department steadily declining, shootings by police officers steadily declining, use of force steadily declining. And he passed that to Jim O'Neill, who drove it further down, and Dermot Shea. And you would think, at a time when every single indicator was trending in the right direction, that destiny would take a hand. Politicians would rewrite laws. The bar would be set higher, making the job more difficult for police. COVID would come along and dealt a terrible blow to the NYPD. And we're still reeling coming out of that. I think we're seeing that turn the corner now, but it's been a very difficult couple of years. But watching Bill Bratton was watching a guy who could always see the big picture and never lost the common touch. He could be arguing with the mayor, the governor, the president, the advocates, and yet walk into a room with a little old lady or the child of a police officer or a young rookie, and he could make that connection.
Bill Bratton, by the way, if you listen to this episode here with Commissioner Miller, I'm just saying, come on the show. Maybe you want to come on the show and give me some time.
I know a guy who knows him who could probably twist his arm.
That would be nice. I've been trying for years to get him on the show, so hopefully he can. And that brings us to your time in ABC, and I'll try to hit on a few more things. I don't want to keep it too long. You're a very busy guy, and I appreciate you even being here. But
thank you for having me.
No problem. ABC News. I talked about working with great people at the NYPD. You get to do that at ABC. And one of the people that, is sadly not with us anymore either, because cancer is just an awful disease, and that's Peter Jennings. Just somebody who brought so much grace to his position, a terrific journalist. You sat next to him covering 9/11 together, which I'll touch on in a little bit, but just to be around him every day. Share some of your favorite memories of Peter Jennings.
Peter Jennings was amazing. Here's a guy somewhat similar to me, not being amazing, but the similarity was, not a college education, not born with a silver spoon, the son of a radio reporter, who made his own way as a very young guy moving through the business. And who did he become? He became erudite, articulate, extraordinarily intelligent, but also worldly, who could dial up presidents or kings, who was known throughout the world, who had paid his dues in the Middle East during the most dangerous time to be covering Beirut and Israel and the region, and had, settled into the anchorman's chair where he wasn't the familiar fatherly type, the Tom Brokaw, the Dan Rather, but he was the slightly more sophisticated. Yes, he was Canadian. He said, I had to wait for my mom to pass away before I could finally become an American citizen. But he was amazing to watch under pressure, breaking news, whether it was a sudden address to the nation by the president in a crisis, or whether it was the actual crisis unfolding. On 9/11, when the towers collapsed, I was sitting next to Peter Jennings, and as we watched this shocking event occur, I started to say something and he held up a finger. He knew that we were full screen with video, but he also understood that nothing I was going to blurt out spontaneously at that shocking moment was going to add more to it than letting the audience watch it, take it in, begin to absorb it. He understood it would take time for them to absorb the entirety of it, but begin to absorb it without anybody talking for a minute. And when the dust began to settle, after a good minute of silence on TV, which almost never happens, where nobody says anything, he let that set in. And he leaned into the camera and he said, "What we've seen is devastating. There is no telling what the casualties might be in terms of numbers, but we know it will be terrible, a terrible loss. And New York City has changed forever. Not just the city and who we are and what this means, but even the skyline of New York City in the last moments has been altered forever. The towers are gone. We're trying to," and I remember thinking, wow, that was very fast that somebody, some writer somewhere who's apparently very good, was able to bang out a script that not only gave the gravity of the scene, but also perspective on its meaning go for. And I leaned over to his teleprompter where the words would go by and the writer's initials would be in the corner. And there was nothing there. It was just his ability to be able to capture a moment that called for understanding and to break it down and to be able to take it apart and put it back together for people so that they too could think about it in some logical way. He was amazing to work with. And he set a very high bar. I was always flying by the seat of my pants on deadline. I would hand in scripts and he would call me over and sit me down and say, "This number is wrong." How did he know that? You know, this sentence is constructed in reverse. You need to switch those. And, you know, this lead is actually pretty good. So I'm going to take that because it's so far the best explanation of your story. That will be my lead in. You will start here. So I used to write two leads, one that was good enough for him to steal and one that I had on the side. So I still had a good lead that he hadn't seen. But, you know, you had to measure up to his standard. He was a tough taskmaster, did not suffer fools, and yet was generous with his time and his teaching. Aside from all that, he ran a whole charity for a school for underprivileged kids that he did a party for at his own expense every year, and a bunch of other things. He was a guy who gave, but also gave back, and it was a great experience to work with him.
I'm going to go back to 9/11 in a moment, but I want to pivot back, and this kind of all goes together to an interview that you did, which I think is a defining interview of your career, in my personal opinion. That is, of course, with Osama Bin Laden at his compound in 1998. This is a two-part question. We'll get to the interview itself momentarily, but as far as being able to get in touch with Bin Laden, who was an elusive figure, and I remember the ABC News report that aired on Nightline with Ted Koppel at the time in 1998 being titled "The Most Dangerous Man You've Never Heard of." So being able to get in touch with the man that nobody could really find, take me through that process first.
It started with, you know, the echo of Bin Laden's names. When I was in the NYPD, the first World Trade Center bombing in '93 had happened, but, you know, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, FBI, NYPD had captured Ramzi Youssef, had captured Mahmoud Abu Halima, had captured Hakim Murad, had captured Wali Khan. So, you know, how the plot worked and who was in charge, the fact that Ramzi Youssef was the mastermind came together. But in the background of the Ramzi Youssef case, Murad's case, the trial of the blind sheikh, this name kept surfacing just beneath, you know, the top. Osama Bin Laden. El-Sayed Nosair's uncle traveled to Pakistan. Who did he meet with? Osama bin Laden. These guys went to a training camp. Who was it run by? Osama bin Laden. So it was this echo that was going through. And I remember thinking, Osama bin Laden, what does it mean? And then I met with somebody who said, there's a federal case into Osama bin Laden. He's probably going to be charged as the guy who actually financed and maybe even ordered the World Trade Center bombing. And that was what set into motion the idea of how do we reach out to a group that can reach out to a group that could reach out to bin Laden. Chris Isham from ABC News put together the contacts. We met with a guy in Virginia who led us to a guy in London, who led us to a guy in Pakistan, and the wheels began to turn about a meeting to interview Osama bin Laden. I just wanted to put the story on the air, but Chris said, don't put the story on the air, find the guy, talk to the guy, then you'll have a story that resonates beyond the night you put it on. And he was right about that.
This is May of 1998 when this interview takes place. And he made, in that interview, which I watched and got chills down my spine, knowing what he would be responsible for later, to that point, he had made no bones. This is the interesting part about the interview. He makes no bones about financing Ramzi Youssef's getaway. It was believed he financed the room that Ramzi Youssef stayed in following the 93 bombing. Makes no bones about being involved in an operation that shot down U.S. Helicopters in Somalia. Makes no bones about his involvement in the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia in 1996. And a few months after this interview takes place, the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania take place, killing 224 innocent people. So you're sitting across from a man who, like Gotti, is pure evil, but so much different. Very calculated, but there's nothing elusive about him. He says it in that interview. So I always wanted to ask you this, especially after watching that interview. When you're sitting just mere feet from this man, who we know would be responsible for something even more devastating 3 years later, what's going through your mind? Journalistic curiosity or intense fear?
Yes. That was the answer, yes. I had written a list of questions. Did you bomb the World Trade Center in 1993? Did you plot to kill President Clinton in Manila? Did you have a plan to assassinate the Pope using Ramzi Youssef and his team? Did you know Ramzi Youssef? Did you know Wali Khan? I was trying to get him to talk about knowing about the plots, knowing the people that had been sent here to blow up the World Trade Center, and where this was all supposed to go. And the challenge as a journalist was they agreed that he would answer all of the questions because they had me write them down so that they could translate them. And I thought, some of these questions might be too provocative. But Zawahiri, his number 2 at the time, said, no, he'll answer each one of them. We've translated the questions, go through them in the same order. And he was giving these very lengthy answers, but they refused to translate the answers to me in real time. So at the end of the answer, I didn't know what he'd said. So I didn't have the ability to ask the logical follow-up question or challenge the answer. I just went on to the next question. But if you looked at the questions, they were important questions to ask. And I was getting long answers. But, after the interview, you get to the translation and you say, well, what's in there? Does he say I blew up the World Trade Center? No, he's cagey about it. Does he say he knew Ramzi Youssef? He says not before the bombing, which indicates he knew him after the bombing, since Ramzi was captured in a guest house owned by bin Laden, as you point out, Mike. But when you get to the heart of it, it wasn't about the individual plots or incidents. The real message was in the message. He said, I predict a black day for the United States, after which the states will no longer be united. I think what he meant was he thought after fighting the Russians in Afghanistan and watching the collapse of the Soviet Union, he could replicate that with the United States. He said, this will be bigger than our battle with the Russians, and that you will come to understand this when you leave our lands. He was talking about the US bases in Saudi Arabia, the no-fly zone over Iraq, our support of Israel, the Palestinians. He said, you will understand this when you leave our lands, when you are dragging the bodies in the coffins and boxes in your shameful defeat. And, you know, I declare war on America. And this fatwa, meaning religious decree, is not just against those in the military uniform. Civilians are a target in this fatwa also. All of that, when you put that on the air shot the interview May 28th, we aired it June 10th. A worldwide travel alert, you know, went out for Americans in the Middle East to be careful and cautious, especially in Saudi Arabia. But then it faded away, and, you know, a guy in a cave on a mountain declaring war against a superpower sounded far-fetched and nothing that we all had to cower about here. I mean, I think we all understood, whether journalists, soldiers, or citizens, that the world was a dangerous place already and that bad things could happen to American targets overseas. But if you played that Bin Laden interview on 9/11, I predict a black day for America. I declare war on America. We will drag the bodies in boxes and coffins. Suddenly it sounded very prescient, very intentional, very strategic, very planned out, very not ridiculous for a country that was struggling, as Peter Jennings pointed out that night on live TV, to redefine what does war look like? What does safety and security look like at home? How does America play into this? Against what kind of enemy? Not a nation state, not someone that you can deliver sanctions against in the United Nations or strongly condemn their actions or declare war against country to country, but a new form of war and new questions about where were Americans safe, if not abroad, if not at home.
It has been 23 years since that interview. It is about to be 20 years, hard to believe, since September 11th. And that was his last Western interview. The year before, with Peter Arnett of CNN, he had declared jihad in 1997. So that wasn't the first time he had declared his intentions. But this is the last interview he's done with the Westerner. As you look back 20 years after the 11th, 10 years after he was killed by U.S. Special Forces, realizing you were the last Westerner to ever talk to him, how does that make you feel?
I remember working as the Deputy Assistant Director for Intelligence Analysis in the Director of Intelligence Office in Washington, D.C., when I got the call that Bin Laden had been killed. And I remember going out, you know, onto the front porch. I brought the laptop with me. I brought up the president's press conference, and I watched President Obama talk about that night and that killing and what that meant. And then I watched all of the news coverage on Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, the networks. And I remember watching one of the foreign stations online and seeing Bin Laden come into the room wearing his green army fatigue and his white scarf and sit down and lean the gun up against the map of the world and start talking. And I remember thinking, you're watching this on television. This is the end of the Bin Laden chapter. It's not the end of the book, but this is going to make everything different. And this chapter is over. And this piece of video you're looking at is the guy he's facing as he sits down and leans up his gun against the map. That's you. And I remember thinking back, this started as a news story for you. I have a lead. It can lead to an interview. The interview could break through in terms of who is this guy and what does he mean to American security? And that led to 9/11, which led to at least 2 wars, one of which just ended. And I remember thinking of all the people lost in between. John O'Neill from the FBI, who was killed on 9/11, who was the point man on the Bin Laden case and one of my best friends. Danny Richards from the bomb squad, my friends from ESU, the fire commissioner,
Ron Bucca.
all these decent people, not decent, all these superb human beings, dedicated heroes. And thinking in that moment, as I sat there watching that on the porch, how does your crime story become a war? And it did. How does your war become history? And it has. And how do we get to a place 20 years later where we'll go back to ground zero and we'll look up at a tower that tells us about resilience and rebuilding? That's a good thing. And we'll look down into those fountains, and that tells us about remembrance and honor. And that's a good thing. But it has been quite a road from there and that little hut dug into a hole in the mountain with a list of 16 questions, and where we are today, and all we have spent, and all the dedicated, superb people who are here fighting to prevent that next attack against New York City. Our partners across the street in the Joint Terrorism Task Force, those agents and our detectives, the people here in the Intelligence Bureau who go to work every day saying, what did we miss? What rock am I not looking under? What page did I not read in that file? What name connects to another name? What database should I check? Or down the hall at the Counterterrorism Bureau where they're saying, do we have the right training? Are we up to speed? Are we reviewing those plots from overseas every day on the terrorist tactics, training, and procedure? Are we stepping up to match those with the right equipment, the right people, the right response? Will it be fast enough, swift enough, sure enough to counter it if it happens? And that, all of that, classified briefings, undercover operations, plots being thwarted, doors being taken, people being arrested while they build a bomb or buy a gun to do that attack. Mike, all of that is not a special day. All of that is an average day today in the effort that protects New York City that we've invested so much in. And I'm really proud of all those people. And I think your friends who are gone now and my friends who were lost on that day, our mutual friends that we know from in person and from stories, would be proud to see what's being done to make sure that never happens again.
I mentioned Ron Bucca. Ron Bucca was an FDNY fire marshal and the first to warn of Al Qaeda's presence following the 93 bombing. He was also an Army intelligence officer for my listeners, and he made it to the 78th floor of the South Tower that day and lost his life among the 343 firemen who did. And you heard Commissioner Miller mention Dan Richards. Of course, if you go back to my Bomb Squad miniseries, I've profiled Detective Richards' life extensively and have dedicated a few of my episodes to his memory. Great man. And if you go down Morton and Barrow Street in Greenwich Village, it's named after him. It was renamed after him in 2003. So, just a last note on 9/11. You talk about heroism, and then we'll move on to the final segment. And it's been a great conversation with you. You were listening to the scanner for the NYPD, for the FDNY, I believe for the FBI as well, who lost Special Agent Leonard Hatton that day in the line of duty. These are men and women who, some of which didn't come home. You mentioned Dan Richards. I mean, he didn't come home that day. A lot of people in ESU coming over the radio that didn't come home that day. How often does that radio chatter from that day play in your head?
I have been listening to the police radio, as you know, since I was 7. I have heard everything. And then, you never say that because that's never quite true. Listening that day to Joe Esposito come on the air and say, Car 3 to Central, New York is under attack, evacuate these buildings, call a level 4 mobilization, do this thing, to hear him be so clear, so decisive. And, I've heard riots transmitted over the air. I've heard building collapses transmitted. I've heard shootouts transmitted where you could hear the gunfire in the background. I have never heard anybody get on the Special Operations Division frequency and transmit a war over the air. New York City is under attack. And, I don't go by the World Trade Center on the way down here every day or on the way back home every day without looking and having some part of that flash back through my mind. and it always will. That was a day on the radio where you heard voices you recognized of people you knew, and then you would learn that you would never hear them again later that day. You can't forget that.
And of course, it'll be the 20th anniversary next Saturday. Hard to believe. I mean, even I was 1 year old when this happened, but just from an outside perspective, learning about it in school, talking with individuals like yourself and our mutual friends about their experiences that day, I never fail to get chills down my spine because, I mean, Peter Jennings said it best a few years afterwards. Where he said, you know, I think this is one of his last interviews. And now it all seems so clear. Plane hits building, building falls down, building falls down. But at the time, and you get this from hearing the stories, both from the NYPD and the FDNY, at the time, it was anything but. It was total chaos. Nobody knew what was happening and what was next, even after the buildings had fallen down. So I can't thank you enough for being here. And I want to get now, we'll end on a light note with the segment of this podcast that I end every podcast with, and that is rapid fire. 5 hit and run questions from me and 5 answers from you. Are you ready?
I hope so.
And you can say pass if you want. First, funniest story you ever covered as a reporter?
Funniest story I ever covered as a reporter was probably the beehive on Madison Avenue. That was thousands of bees had landed on a traffic light, and they were waiting for all the experts to come. And a slightly intoxicated guy who spoke only Spanish came along and talked all the bees into a big bin and walked away with them and a beer can. And it was one of those great New York narratives.
Who knew bees were bilingual? There you go.
He kept saying Lorena to the Queen. I'm like, he's talking to the Queen now. We got it all on camera.
I say this as a Dominican man. He was probably Dominican because that is something that we would do. We are a nutty bunch, believe me. So second,
he took care of the problem.
Hey, he got it done. Kudos to him. Second, interview you wish you could have conducted.
Interview I wish I could have done. Dead or alive?
Yeah, dead or alive, doesn't matter.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Interesting. And for first NYPD commissioner in the modern era, I believe, and of course, future president of the United States. Third, I think you kind of touched on this earlier, but nonetheless, I'll ask you, best advice anyone ever gave you, either for law enforcement, news, or just life in general?
Best advice anybody ever gave me was treat everyone the same. If it's the person who cleans the office, or if it's the king of Jordan, if you treat everyone the same, you never have to worry about how to think of how to treat someone.
Interesting. Very well said. Fourth, you've been in some, you've rubbed elbows with some pretty prominent people, so you've been in some great places as a result. Favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
Well, it always first Pedro's, because that's where my mom was the bartender. Mm-hmm. And it was always entertaining to watch her work, and it was always economical to drink there. Then Elaine's, and Elaine's was like everybody's mom. And she, by the way, knew that thing about treating everybody the same. She had no problem yelling at the most famous person in the world or the biggest loser. If you crossed her, she told you. And that's why she walked with kings and queens and never lost a common touch. Favorite restaurant? I have two. One is Campagnola, Italian restaurant on First Avenue. And the other is Come Prima, Italian restaurant on Madison Avenue. And they are the places where you walk in and they just make you feel at home, like you're in mom's Italian kitchen, even if mom's not Italian.
And so for the fifth and final question, given the experiences you've had in life on both sides of the aisle, law enforcement, news, and just things in general that happen to us in life, if you could go back in time and give advice to a young John Miller, knowing what you know now, what would you tell him?
I would tell him that whatever your dream is, whatever you want to be, I would tell him or her that people will tell you you can't do it. They'll tell you why you can't do it. They'll tell you why you shouldn't do it. But if that's what you want to be and who you want to be, no one can stop you. And I say that as a kid who wanted to be a news photographer, who turned into a TV reporter at 15 years old on the air, who wanted a career in law enforcement and became Deputy Commissioner of the NYPD, Assistant Director of the FBI, Deputy Director of National Intelligence. If you set your sights and you don't listen to the people who say, that's not going to work, you can make it work. And that would be the advice I would give. An opportunity today where you don't necessarily have to get hired by the entity you're looking for. There's globalization, there's the internet, there's the ability to build your own and expose your talents, whether you're Justin Bieber or an aspiring news reporter or an author of a book. Opportunity abounds, but don't let people set the bar and say, you'll never make it.
That concludes what is the milestone episode 100 of the Mike and Abe podcast. I can't thank you enough for stopping by and chatting with me. I hope you had a good time. I know I did. Before we go, just a few, if you want to give a shout out or plugs, whatever the case may be, fire away.
Well, my shout out is to you. Thank you for what you do. The stories you tell and the people you bring on are not necessarily the people that the media would consider the good story, because most of them are good stories about good, done by good people. I love what your show does. I love the people you have on. I love the stories you get to that have never been told before. And I love that you've done it 100 times now, and that I got to be the 100th. But I'm looking forward to the 101st to see who's next, because you have the best people who tell the best stories, and you open a real window for your viewers on the quality of people who do this work.
Well, that means a lot coming from you. Thank you. I don't know how to top that, but I'll do my best on my end. Folks, if you're listening for the first time because you're here for John, stick around. I'd love to have you. My YouTube channel is MC's Audio, MC''S Audio, which is my initials, Mike Colón. And of course, everywhere that you get your podcast, Apple, Spreaker, Spotify, we're there too. Twitter, I'm at Mike in New Haven. Instagram, original_MC1. And LinkedIn, Mike Colón, type in Mike Colón and then MIC''D, because there's a lot of Mike Colóns out there. So if you want to find me in specific, type in Mike Colón, MIC''D, and connect with me. I'd be happy to have you. If you have any sports-related inquiries for the podcast, I do sports guests too. As you may know, if you're a longtime listener of the show, hit me up, 917-727-0891, or email me, Colón on Sports, COLON on Sports, @gmail.com, or any other inquiries, law enforcement, fire service, news, hit me up there, 917-781-6189, or email me the Colón report, THECOLON report @gmail.com. Well, coming up for episode 101 of the Mike and Abe podcast, 23 New York City police officers lost their lives at the World Trade Center on 9/11. But if had it not been for my next guest, the number would have been substantially higher. Ken Winkler, retired NYPD Emergency Service Unit detective, who was there that day and immediately got on the radio and told units to evacuate the North Tower before it was too late, will join me. That will be volume 2 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, episode 101. On behalf of NYPD Deputy Commissioner John Miller, this has been episode 100 of the Mike and Abe podcast. We will see you next time. Take care, everyone.